Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to review the AOKZOE A2. This is yet another handheld PC in a market that's already very crowded. In fact, there are so many different Windows handhelds to choose from, all within the same kind of price and performance standpoint, that it gets pretty hard to pick which one's going to be the best. But I will say that the A2 that we're reviewing here today actually has some things that are somewhat best in class, including some really excellent analog sticks, as well as ergonomic controls. And so after a week and a half of testing, I'm ready to talk about all the good and bad that came with my play experience with the A2 and whether it might be a good fit for you. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive right in. Okay, let's start with the specs. And the CPU here is the tried and true AMD Ryzen 7 7840U. And this chip is the same one we've seen in a bunch of other high-end handheld PCs. And it's also very similar to the Z1 Extreme chip that is found in the ROG Ally and the Lenovo Legion Go. So chances are, if you've been looking at a Windows handheld, it's probably going to have this chip as well. Now the RAM spec here is pretty great. It actually starts at 32 gigs of LPDDR5X, and the RAM speed's also clocked at a full 7500 MHz. And of note, the prototype I was using for review was only clocked at 6400 MHz, so your performance will be better than you'll see in this video. And as I'll show you in a moment, there's actually an option to bump this RAM up to a full 64 gigs if you'd like as well. In terms of storage, the base model is 512 gigs using a full M.2 2280 drive, but like with the RAM, you can get a higher spec option of storage as well, all the way up to 4 terabytes. Now the display is a 7-inch IPS LCD panel with a 1920 by 1200p resolution, which comes out to a 16 by 10 aspect ratio. The refresh rate on this is also going to be 60 Hz. And the battery here is 48.5 watt hours or 12,600 milliamp hours. And we'll also do some battery testing at the end of this video. In terms of weight, this is pretty heavy. It's 670 grams, which is just under a pound and a half. For connectivity, we have Wi-Fi 6E as well as Bluetooth 5.2, and it also has 2 different USB 4 ports and a USB-A port. And in terms of operating system, it's running Windows 11. And finally, the last thing worth noting is that this device has both Hall sensor sticks and Hall sensor triggers. Now initially this device launched under an Indiegogo campaign, but that is now completed, so you actually will buy this directly from their website, and the pricing right now starts at $799 for the base model. And if you'd like, you can bump up the specs all the way up to 64 gigabytes of RAM and 4 terabytes of storage. Just bear in mind it's going to increase that price significantly. They also are offering 3 different color options. We have a standard black, then the white one that I'm reviewing today, and they also have what is probably the most off-putting yellow-green color I've ever seen in my life. Anyway, yes, that's what we're looking at here, a base model of $799 for this handheld. And of note, I did pretend to buy the device on their website just to see what shipping is going to be like, and it's actually free. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump over to the unboxing section. Now, just in full disclosure, this was sent over to me as a review unit prototype. But as always, no money was exchanged in any way, and all opinions are my own, and they're not seeing this review ahead of time. Inside the box, we'll get a QR code to see the instructions, and they also have a nice braided USB-C cable. And as far as power adapter, it comes with a 65 watt power plug that's nice and compact. And now let's go ahead and move over to the star of the show and look at the device itself. And first impression, I was really struck by just how rounded this is overall, especially on the bottom edges. This is also the first device from AOKZOE that has a full glass front, and it's pretty easy to see where the glass and the plastic will meet. So I'd say, yeah, just my very first reaction when picking this up and just kind of feeling how smooth and rounded it is very impressive. And it's kind of a 2-part function. Not only is the front really smooth along the edges of the hand, but then also the rounded grips on the back just have a nice bulbous kind of feel to them. And so I think that this is going to work for a variety of hand sizes. My hands are medium sized, but even then it just feels a lot roomier than I was expecting. So I do think if you have larger hands, this might be a really great fit as well. Either way, yes, as soon as I picked it up, I felt like this was a very ergonomic device, and that stayed with me throughout my entire time of testing. Now let's do things a little bit differently in this video, and so we'll start with the bottom first. And here you can see we have 2 down-firing stereo speakers and then a USB-C port. And so let's go ahead and do some audio testing. This is at max volume in an untreated room. And you might be able to tell that the volume is pretty darn muted. In fact, this is a lot quieter than I thought it would be. And so we're going to use a third-party app called FX Sound. This is a free download, and I'm going to try this on it as well. And as you can probably figure out, it's a night and day difference. And so I think that without FX Sound, the sound is just a little bit too quiet and muted, but with the FX Sound app, it actually sounds really great. Now it is an additional app you'll have to download, and I'll actually leave it linked in the video description. But as it's tuned right now, I would say it's kind of a necessary component to make sure you're getting good audio. And so it's one of those things where yes, the AOKZOE A2 actually has great sound, but you are going to have to use this app as well. And while we're on the topic of audio, let's go ahead and test the max fan sound as well. And I'm using a custom profile that will push it to 100% fan speed, but then also I'll have it cut out here and there so you can tell the difference in the ambient room. Overall, I would say the fan is relatively loud, but not annoyingly so, and I think the overall tone and sound of it is pretty pleasant as well. Okay, next up, let's talk about the top I/O. On the far left, we have our power and volume buttons. And then after that, we have our LED indicator, our microphone headphone jack, and then our second USB 4 port. And then it also has a full USB-A port, and then finally our micro SD card slot, and then of course we have our exhaust vent here at the top as well. Next, let's move over to the shoulders and triggers. Let's start with the triggers first. Like I mentioned before, these are Hall sensors and they have an analog input. And I think they feel really good. They don't have a super long travel to them, but that's something I like in my handhelds. And it has a smooth and solid feel to it, so no complaints here. Both the triggers and the shoulder buttons have a more metallic finish to them, but they are still plastic keys. And the shoulders are also very easy to press down on. They have a very light actuation force to them and don't have a lot of travel either. So overall, I like both the triggers and the shoulder buttons. These feel really great. Moving to the front of the device, we have our select and start buttons here on the top. And now let's move over to these analog sticks. Now these are also magnetic Hall sensors and feel really smooth to the touch. The caps themselves feel a little bit like a PlayStation's controller, but maybe a little bit smaller. And overall, I would say these sticks are a little bit smaller than on a full console's controls, but they also have a really good range of motion. And when you combine that with the smooth feeling of these sticks overall, it's a really nice experience. Even though these sticks are smaller than on a console's controller, I still don't feel like they're a step down. And I think that's something that AOKZOE has always done a pretty great job with their other handheld PCs. And that is, I feel like they're made with a first-person shooter kind of mindset. And I'm not really sure if this is deliberate, but honestly, every time I play a first-person shooter game, I just feel like it's a really natural fit with most of their devices. And all things considered, I think that the A2 fits that bill as well. It has really nice analog sticks, and those nice gliding triggers feel really good too. Now, I wouldn't go as far as to call it perfect. I think I'd still rather just play on an Xbox controller. And I know there's a lot of people out there who would prefer to have something like trackpads as well for their control scheme. But as it stands from an analog stick and trigger function, I think they've really dialed that in. Okay, next we're going to move over to the D-pad. This has a rubber membrane connection, and right off the bat, I can tell you that the controls here feel pretty shallow. The travel at the cardinal points I think is fine, but when you're trying to pivot from the center, it definitely feels too shallow for me. So let's try a couple tests to see what I'm talking about while actually playing a game. We'll start with the contra test. Here I'm going to press down on the D-pad and then move left and right. And ideally, I want to make sure that my character doesn't move too much, but still a little bit. And here you can see that the character is not moving at all. And right off the bat, that usually means to me that it's not going to have false diagonals and that you're going to hit a diagonal when you don't want to. But because the character isn't moving at all, that does make me worry that it's going to be hard to press the diagonals when I actually try to do them. And sure enough, just moving my character around, I can feel that when I want to hit a diagonal, it's not actually doing it. So let's shift over to a game that relies on diagonals. We're going to start with a Capcom fighting game, Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. Now when it comes to throwing a fireball or dragon punch in this game, it's actually relatively forgiving. And so it is one of the easier games when testing a D-pad to make sure it can do a Hadouken or Shoryuken. But as you can see from the footage here, I'm having a hard time actually nailing any of those moves. I can throw a Hadouken maybe 25% of the time, but the Shoryuken is a lot worse, maybe 10% success rate. And this is exactly what I was fearing, in that it is hard to press a diagonal when I want to. And so in this case in particular, I would not call this D-pad Hadoukenable or Shoryukenable. It's just too hard to actually nail those moves. And finally, the last test, just to make sure that I'm not taking crazy pills, is going to be with Celeste. Now this is a game I would consider to be a precision platform. That means it's really important to make sure you hit a diagonal when you want to, and then you don't when you don't. out. And unfortunately, just in even this little spot right here, I can tell you that I'm not hitting the moves that I want. And so unfortunately, Celeste is not a game I would actually want to play on the AOKZOE A2. And I think the device will work fine with a lot of modern games. For example, when you just need to use the D-pad to like change out a weapon or take a potion. But if you do plan on playing a game that relies on D-pad controls, I expect you're gonna run into some issues when trying to play those games. So yeah, unfortunately, I would say this D-pad does leave a lot to be desired. And finally, on the left side, we also have this show desktop button here on the bottom left. And moving over to the right side, let's talk about these face buttons. And thankfully, these are something that AOKZOE has always done a great job with, and it's no exception here. These face buttons have a little bit of a smooth polish to them and are also relatively flat but have a shallow travel. And so I think these feel pretty great. They are a little bit on the small side compared to something like an Xbox controller, but the fact that they are flat does give them a little bit more of a wider appeal. And I think the way the right analog stick is positioned, it's not going to get in the way of you pressing the face buttons either. In fact, as you can see here, the design of the D-pad and the right analog stick are pushed a little bit inboard. And finally, on the right side, we have two function buttons on the bottom. We'll go over these in more detail when I actually get into the software. Now on the back, we don't have a lot going on. We have our intake vent here in the center, and then each side is flanked by these rather roomy and large grips. And you can definitely tell from the design language of this device that they really put ergonomics first and foremost when it came to making this overall design. And I do like the fact that they're using that full front of glass. Not only does it hide the screen bezel, but it also gives it a really premium feel when you're pressing your hand against it. And I do appreciate the fact that they rounded basically everything that they could, not only the back, but then also the front part, especially where the plastic meets the glass. And so overall, I found this to be a genuine pleasure to pick up and play. And I'm not really sure why I look so grumpy in this footage right here, because I'm having a great time. I'm not sure if I was just concentrating on what's on the screen, but either way, yes, this is a very comfortable handheld to hold. Next, I want to talk about the overall size in comparison to a couple choice handhelds. We'll start with the ROG Ally because I think in terms of size, these are both very similar. The AOKZOE A2 has a taller screen. It's a 16:10 aspect ratio, but because it doesn't have those huge bezels on the top and bottom like the ROG Ally, they do look somewhat similar. You can also see that the AOKZOE A2 is quite a bit smaller than the Steam Deck OLED. So if anything, among all of the other handheld PCs, I would consider the A2 to just be kind of middle-sized. Here's another size comparison against the previous AOKZOE, the A1 Pro. And this one is larger. It also has a larger screen. This one is 8 inches altogether. And if you want to go even bigger, here's the Lenovo Legion Go. This screen is 8.8 inches. Now, even though the sizes are different, there are two other handhelds that really remind me of the A2. The first is the One X Fly. This one's a little bit smaller, but has the same chipset. And the company that makes this one is very similar to AOKZOE. In fact, their software is almost identical. And in addition to the software likeness, I feel like the overall ergonomic design is pretty similar as well, even though they are a bit of a different size. Another device that's pretty similar to me is the AOKZOE 2 or 2S. This is the only other handheld PC I've tested that has a full front plate glass as well. But even though these have a pretty similar design, I would say that they overall have a different feel to them in the hand. For example, the AOKZOE 2 has always been a device I've struggled to hold properly, and some of that has to do with the really curved edges to this device, but then also the grips themselves just have a kind of weird shape to them. And so often when I'm gripping this device, it doesn't feel like I have a good handle on it. Meanwhile, the back grips on the AOKZOE just seems to fit a hand more naturally, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that they put some weight at the bottom of that grip. And so as a result, it just rests more naturally in your palm. And by contrast, the One X Fly, which we were just talking about a second ago, has that exact same design property. And so both of these just feel a lot more naturally ergonomic than the AOKZOE 2, and I think they feel a lot better in the hand. Now, in terms of weight, this is pretty heavy. It's 670 grams, which makes it about 10% heavier than the ROG Ally, and it's also a little bit heavier than the Steam Deck OLED as well. Now, that being said, when actually using this device just in my day-to-day testing over about a week and a half, there was never really a moment where I thought to myself, wow, this is a heavy handheld. If anything, it just feels kind of hefty and beefy, but it was never really to the point where I thought that it was just too heavy for its size. And honestly, I just had a really great time using this handheld. Not only is it nice and ergonomic, but it has a good solid heft to it as well. And so from just an overall comfort standpoint, I think that the AOKZOE A2 is one of the best out there right now. Okay, now let's move over and talk about the screen. To start, as you can see, they're calling it a bezel-less design. And it does look pretty great, but one thing to keep in mind is that the bezel is still there, it's just somewhat hidden. In fact, if you run your finger across where the bezel should be, there's a little divot to let you know where it actually was. And so if anything, I think it's just a clever way of hiding the bezel to make it look like it's not there. Next, I want to talk about the quality of the screen itself. And right off the bat, I noticed there wasn't a huge range between the dimmest and brightest settings. I would say at the dimmest setting, it does get pretty low. It's actually a pretty great device to use in the dark, but I don't think it gets as bright as it should, and I also think that the blacks are not very dark. Let me give you a few examples just to show you what I'm talking about. This first one here is in a well-lit room right next to a window, and I would say it's definitely going to be playable in this kind of scenario, but it is rather light looking. Not only do the colors look pretty muted, but the blacks don't look very deep either. And so I would say in a bright daylight scenario like this while still indoors, yeah, it's definitely playable, but not an optimal experience. Meanwhile, let's take it outside and do two different scenarios. Here I am outdoors but under shade, and as you can see, it's barely playable at this point. And bear in mind, this is at full brightness. You could still play a game in these circumstances, but I don't think it'd be very enjoyable. And if we move over into direct sunlight, it is basically impossible. You can see a little bit of what's going on the screen, but honestly, you're seeing more finger smudges than anything. So this is definitely not a device I would say you would want to play outdoors at all. To give you an example, here's a comparison with the ROG Ally and the OLED Steam Deck, and all three of these are at full brightness. And as you can see, there's a huge difference between all three of these. The blacks are much darker on the other two, and the colors are also more rich and vibrant. And so if anything, if you plan on playing this device in a well-lit environment, I would say you need to temper your expectations. Now, to be fair, when playing in a more controlled environment, for example, under indoor lighting, it actually works really well. This is me playing in about 50% brightness just in my studio, and I think that the colors here look very nice and everything looks pretty great. However, like I mentioned, this is a lower brightness setting than I would expect in an outdoor environment. And so it's really going to come down to where you plan on playing this device. If you plan on just kind of kicking back on your living room sofa, I think it'll be fine. However, if you plan on playing this, like say for example in your car while sitting in a parking lot, or maybe taking it on travel, it might be something to consider. Because not only is the picture pretty hard to see, but the colors get pretty muted when you're in a light environment as well. In fact, it's so muted that my autofocus on my camera had a hard time picking up on the screen even when I was pointing it directly at the character. By contrast, something like the Steam Deck OLED at max brightness is so bright that it kind of washes out the image here on my camera. And so my big takeaway here is that yes, the brightness on this device is quite a bit lower than I was hoping, and when you push it to max brightness, it doesn't look great. The colors are going to be washed out and the black is not very dark. Okay, let's move over to the software experience. Like I mentioned before, this is a Windows-based handheld, and the AOKZOE A2 does come with its own suite of software. If we long press on the turbo button on the bottom right, it'll actually bring up their own launcher. Now, this is similar to other handhelds in the fact that it's just going to scrub from your Steam and Epic libraries, and then it's going to put all your games in one place right here where you can launch them. And there are a couple minor tweaks you can do here within the settings. For example, here you can actually see all of the different controls and map them to your own specifications, but for the purposes of this testing, I just kept everything at its default kind of Xbox style controls. One other thing worth noting is if you were to try to use the AOKZOE launcher, I found it to be quite a bit more sluggish than just using the launchers within Epic Game Store or even Steam. So even though it is nice that it consolidates all the various stores into one, I'm not really sure how enjoyable of an experience it would be to actually use. Now, in addition to the launcher, there are a couple of other options. For example, the other right button on the bottom is going to be your keyboard button, so you can bring up an on-screen keyboard anytime you need it. Also, if we long press that turbo button again, it'll get rid of that game launcher, and if we do a quick tap on that same button, it'll bring up the quick menu. And this quick menu is very similar to other AOKZOE and 1X Player products. We've got some standard functions like the ability to adjust the TDP anywhere from 4 watts all the way up to 30. We can also adjust the fan curve as well as the vibration settings, and we've got a couple other things we can tweak as well. For example, we can adjust the Windows resolution, and there's also a variety of presets we can use for the RGB effects around the analog sticks. Now, a couple of these functions are actually new. For example, we can turn on and off the CPU turbo, and they've also included an onboard gyroscope, and by default, this is actually going to work with the mouse cursor. And depending on the game that you're playing, this will actually work pretty seamlessly. For example, with this mode turned on, Doom Eternal will have gyro controls, and that's actually going to work in addition to the analog sticks. So the way I found it is that you can use the analog sticks to just kind of do your gross movements, and then if you want to get a little bit more granular to make sure you get that headshot, you can adjust it using the gyro. However, one thing to note is I found that the gyro controls with the mouse function was not quite as smooth as I was hoping, and so because it was a little bit jerky, I found it to be not quite as precise as I wanted. And as a result, I ended up just not really using this, even though I kind of like using gyro controls with certain first-person games. So if anything, I would say that maybe with a little bit more tweaking to make this more smooth, it could be better. But as it stands right now, I didn't find it to be a smooth experience as compared to something like the Steam Deck or the ROG Ally. And also bear in mind, this gyroscope setup will not work with every single game. For example, with Portal 2, the same setup didn't work at all. However, within the gyro controls, there are quite a few different options that you can choose from, so if you want to tweak it a little bit more, you might be able to get some better experiences. Anyway, other than that, the other thing worth noting is that you can adjust the brightness and the volume right here within the quick menu as well. Now, one function I found missing in the quick menu that I really wish they had is the ability to turn off the inbuilt controls on the device. For example, if you wanted to play games in docked mode with a Bluetooth controller, it actually doesn't work with many games. And that's because by default, the inbuilt controls are going to be player 1. And this is a very common problem with a lot of other Windows handhelds, but most of these have the ability to turn off the inbuilt controls within the quick menu function. And so unfortunately, unless you plan on going into Device Manager and actually disabling the controls, it's going to be pretty hard to use this in docked mode. Now, there will be some games that will work no matter what. For example, Shredder's Revenge doesn't really care which controller you have hooked up, and so there are going to be many games like this that will work just fine. However, it gets pretty frustrating when the game you do want to play doesn't actually work. And so I'm going to pass this feedback to the company as well, but I do hope they implement this in their quick menu controls at some point in the future. Now, for the rest of my PC game testing, I'm just going to use the Steam Big Picture interface just because it's a lot more snappy than the AOKZOE one, and so all the games that I'll be testing on PC will be through this interface instead. Now, because I've tested this chip so many times, I didn't want to just kind of go through my same old song and dance, and so instead I tried something different, and that is I turned everything to the 30-watt TDP, and then I just kind of let the game regulate itself and figure out what TDP it worked at the best. And so here I'm going to start with the most lightweight games and work my way up, and you'll be able to see on screen as well as in my caption exactly which TDP I found to work best with which game. And of course, as expected, all the lightweight games will do pretty well at about 10 watts or lower, but as you start working your way up to games like Hades and beyond, you will have to adjust that TDP to something a little bit higher. And like with other handhelds using the 7840U chip, I found that around the 15 watt TDP will work best for most lightweight games, especially as you start moving towards those that are a little bit more 3D oriented, something like Portal 2 or Risk of Rain 2. Each of these require about 15 watts just to play really well at a 1200p resolution. But as you start moving up, you will have to make some compromises one way or another. For example, with Marvel Spider-Man, I found that about 1200p resolution on low settings still required me to turn FSR on and then also use a 30 frames per second cap. And with those settings applied, I found that around 15 watts was ideal. It would still dip down below that, maybe to about 28 or 29, but overall I would say this is a very playable and console-like experience. Now, if you want to get a better experience, you can try to push the power even more. For example, doubling the wattage up to the full 30 watts will give me about 44 frames per second on average. But personally, I would say this juice isn't really worth the squeeze. We're getting about 50% more performance, but with 100% more power. And this is a pretty common trait with the entire chipset. Basically, anytime you push it beyond 20 watts, you're not going to get a lot of improvement. And so it will come down to a case-by-case basis depending on the game. For example, one of my favorite games to play on this handheld is Destiny 2. Like I mentioned before, it feels like this device is well suited for first-person shooter games. The overall control seems to be designed for that. And for this game, I found the sweet spot is an 800p resolution with medium settings, and then with an 18 watt TDP. This will give me a pretty steady 60 frames per second. And for me personally, with this game, I'd rather have a higher refresh rate than graphical fidelity. And the last example for PC games would be Baldur's Gate 3. This one I preferred to play at a 1200p resolution, but with low settings and FSR Ultra quality. And for me, I think the picture here looked pretty good. After that, I set it to a 30 frames per second cap and then used a 22 watt TDP. And for me, this was the best balance between graphics as well as performance, and the battery life here is not bad either. I got about an hour and a half altogether. We'll talk about that more when I talk about my battery testing at the end of this video. Anyway, from here, let's move on to emulation. I only have a couple things I want to mention here. First of all, because it's a 16:10 aspect ratio screen, 4:3 content actually looks pretty great. We're actually going to get a little bit over 6 inches of content when playing these 4:3 retro systems. And so despite the D-pad not being ideal when it comes to certain types of games, I did find this to be pretty great when it comes to retro games just because of that wider aspect ratio. And also with my testing, I did the same thing. I set it to a 30-watt TDP and saw just how much the emulator actually needed. And for these classic and retro games, I found about an 8-watt TDP was perfectly fine. Now moving on to PlayStation 2, even at a 3x resolution, I found the power requirement was not super high. Many games like Metal Gear Solid 3 only required about 8 or 9 watts, and even the harder to run games, things like Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance was only about 10 watts, and even pushing it all the way up to God of War 2, again at a 3x resolution, only required about 12 or 13 watts. And so I was surprised to find that the power profile didn't need to be super high to play high-end PlayStation 2. And it was a similar experience with GameCube, about 10 or 11 watts with Metroid Prime, and only about 12 watts with Rogue Squadron 2. So this means to me any PlayStation 2 or GameCube game is going to run under 15 watts, which is pretty great. Same thing with most Wii U games. For example, Legend of Zelda Wind Waker only required about 11 or 12 watts altogether. And this game is playing at a full 1080p resolution and it looks great. Now if you want, you can really push the Wii U. For example, here is Breath of the Wild, and I'm using a graphics pack that allows it to run at a full 1200p resolution. Here I'm getting an average frame rate about 30 frames per second, but it does require quite a bit more power, about 21 watts altogether. Either way, this is a game that's definitely playable even at the full resolution of the screen. Now I didn't test every single emulated system on this device just because I've done it with this chipset so many times before, but I did want to show off 2 more systems. We're going to start with PS3. And this chip does a great job with PS3 emulation in particular. For example, the easier to run games like Demon's Souls, no problem here, but even the hardest to run games like God of War 3 can play at a very good frame rate. It's not going to be a full 60 frames per second, but it's still a smooth experience, around 30 frames or maybe 35. Just bear in mind the power requirement on this is pretty high. It's going to require that full 30 watts. So this is a game you'd probably want to play plugged in. Finally, the last system I wanted to show off is Nintendo Switch. And this is also an emulated system that requires quite a bit of power. And so here again, I pushed it to that full 30 watts and it usually required about 28 or 29 every single time. But bear in mind, I am playing these games in docked mode, which means they're going to be playing at 1080p. And so the graphics here actually look better than if you played it on a Switch, which is going to obviously be in handheld mode. And so in a nutshell, yes, Nintendo Switch emulation on here is pretty great, but it will come at a price, and that's going to be the power concession. So this is something that will probably not last very long on battery. So if you are going to emulate Nintendo Switch in docked mode, I would recommend keeping it plugged in. And speaking of battery, I think it's a great time to talk about the battery life that I got on this device. Now to start, let's talk about the top right. So it takes about 2 hours to charge this device from 0 to 100. And I also found that when putting it to sleep, it lost about 3% of battery overnight. Now for all my testing, I'm going to be playing this at 50% brightness at 50% volume in a controlled environment. And we'll start with our worst case scenario on the far left. This is me playing Spider-Man at a full 30 watt TDP. And here you can see I got a little bit over an hour of battery life altogether. And that's about what I expected with the size of this battery. Now if we want to be a little bit more judicious but still really push the power package, next is going to be Baldur's Gate 3. So here I'm running it at the same settings that I talked about when showing off this game, but at a 22 watt TDP. And here I got about an hour and a half of battery life altogether. Now after that, I throttled it back a little bit and went and played Destiny 2, so at an 18 watt TDP. And with this game, I got a little over 2 hours. And if we make another jump down to a 12 watt TDP, this is kind of a sweet spot when it comes to emulating PlayStation 2, GameCube, as well as Wii U. And this will net us about 2 hours and 45 minutes. And then finally, on the far end of the spectrum, the very best battery life that we can get. This is me playing a short hike at a 7 watt TDP with the default settings. And here I got just under 5 hours of battery life altogether. So in general, I would say the battery life on this device is not great, but it's very similar to how it is with other handheld PCs. When it comes down to it, I would expect your average battery life to be somewhere around 2.5 hours, depending on what you're playing. And whether or not that battery life is going to work for your own use case is really going to depend on how you're going to be playing this device. Anyway, that's my battery testing in a nutshell. Let's go ahead and start wrapping up now and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the AOKZOE A2. And as always, we'll talk about what I like, and there's quite a few things here. Number one, I found this device to be quite comfortable. It's nice and chunky, but then also has some really rounded back grips as well. And there's quite a few control components I liked as well. The analog sticks are nice and smooth, and I also really enjoyed the face buttons and the smooth triggers. And overall, I think it's a decent size. It's about the size of an ROG Ally, but has a much more rounded feel to it overall. Additionally, I still really like the performance and battery life on this device. Yes, it's the same as most others within this field, but I do love the fact that this thing can play just about any PC game you throw at it and can emulate every system under the sun as well. And while the battery life is not revolutionary in any way, I still think it's going to be decent as long as you're pretty judicious about what power profile you're going to give it. Now, of course, no device is perfect, so let's talk about what I don't like about the AOKZOE A2. And number one, I think by far is going to be the screen quality. I think when playing it in the evening time or under just artificial lights, it's fine. But if you want to play it outdoors or even next to a brightly lit window, you're going to find a lot of compromises there. And I think that for a device that costs $800 plus, I don't think you should have a compromise like that. Another thing that was kind of a deal breaker for me were the D-pad diagonals. It's unfortunate, but the D-pad has always been a sticky spot with most of the AOKZOE devices, and this one is no different. And so unfortunately, if you plan on playing D-pad centric games, that could be fighting games or precision platformers, you're going to have a compromise here as well. Another thing that's not great on this device is the audio quality, at least out of the box. Now, using that free app FX Sound, I was able to fix it, but all the same, I wish I didn't have to tune it myself. Either way, if you do pick one of these up, I do think that app is going to be necessary, so I'll leave it linked down in the video description below. And the last point I want to make is the price on this at $800 does leave me scratching my head against some other competitors. While I do think that price point is still pretty good against others on the market, it's still not a very competitive price compared to other handhelds, for example the ROG Ally with the Z1 Extreme chip. That device has an objectively better screen with a 120Hz refresh panel and variable refresh rate, but then also it gets a lot brighter and has better colors. And to top it off, the ROG Ally with that chip is actually $100 cheaper than the cheapest AOKZOE A2. And so it does leave me wondering who exactly is going to be buying this device in the long run. Because when it comes down to it, I still think the A2 is a good handheld. There are a lot of things it gets right, and it's something that I really enjoyed playing over the past week and a half. There are definitely some issues that I think are pretty glaring, including the screen and the D-pad, but overall it's still a handheld I really enjoyed testing. However, at the $800 price point, if basically anybody asked me, should they get this over the ROG Ally, I think that 10 times out of 10, I'm going to tell people to save your $100 and get the Ally instead. And so in the end, if you're asking whether or not I recommend the AOKZOE A2, I'm of a mixed mind. As it stands right now, if you have access to other cheaper and better handhelds, you should get those. But if this ever goes on sale or you're able to pick it up used, then yeah, it might be a decent handheld to try out. In the end, I think the AOKZOE took about 2 steps forward in terms of controls and ergonomics, but it also took a couple steps back in some key areas, including the screen. And personally, I do always like it when a company like AOKZOE tries to make another handheld, because overall I think we're seeing incremental refinements among all of these different handheld companies. However, I do think that the AOKZOE A2 is really just another step along the way until we find that perfect handheld PC. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you interested in picking up the AOKZOE A2, or are you going to wait for something better or cheaper? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.